In 1986, EMI Music Canada wanted to call its new record store His Master's Voice. RCA said no. The company that owned the rights to that name and to Nipper, the dog on the gramophone, refused to let a Canadian retailer use either one. So it became three letters, HMV. By 1991, that compromise had grown into a three-story glass palace on Yonge Street in Toronto, its windows humming with 36 video screens, its aisles packed with 100 listening posts. Guns N' Roses played inside those walls. The Red Hot Chili Peppers drew a crowd so large, police shut down the intersection outside. 26 years later, on an April afternoon in 2017, the doors on Yonge Street closed for the last time. All 102 Canadian stores went with it. How does a store that once stopped traffic in downtown Toronto simply vanish within a generation? For anyone who ever spent an afternoon flipping through plastic cases under those fluorescent lights, the answer is more complicated than the internet killed it. There was no single visionary standing behind the counter on opening day. HMV Canada was born in a boardroom, not a garage. And that fact alone says something about how differently this story starts compared to the mom-and-pop legends of American retail. In 1986, EMI Music Canada, a British-owned record label already famous for artists on its roster, made a business decision. It bought out a struggling chain called Mr. Sound, a modest string of record shops scattered across the country, and set out to rebrand every location under the name that had sold gramophones and vinyl across the world for over 60 years, His Master's Voice. Then came the problem nobody anticipated. RCA, the American electronics giant, held the trademark to the name and to Nipper, the little dog with his head cocked toward the gramophone horn. RCA had owned that image in the United States and Canada since the 1920s, and RCA was not sharing. EMI's lawyers hit a wall. The company could keep the initials. It could not keep the dog, and it could not spell out the phrase that gave those initials meaning. So the executives in Toronto did what practical people do when the perfect plan falls apart. They adapted. The stores opened simply as HMV. No dog in the window, no slogan on the sign, just four letters that, in time, would come to mean something entirely their own to a generation of Canadians who never gave the missing history a second thought. The first converted Mr. Sound locations were unglamorous by any measure. Narrow storefronts and strip malls in downtown blocks, shelves of vinyl giving way to a new, unfamiliar format called the compact disc. There was no fanfare, no ribbon cutting covered by the national papers. A shopper walking into one of those early stores in 1986 or 1987 would have found modest carpeting, handwritten price tags taped to plastic sleeves, and a staff that, more often than not, cared more about music than about retail metrics. These were not superstores. They were toeholds. But something in that quiet beginning mattered. Canada, at the time, already had its own beloved record store culture. Sam the Record Man's neon sign glowing over Yonge Street, A&A Records just steps away. Independent shops in nearly every city with a university or a downtown strip. HMV was the outsider, the British import with the awkward, truncated name, trying to find its footing in a market that already knew how to love its record stores fiercely. What EMI's Toronto executives believed, and what would prove correct within a decade, was that Canadians were ready for something bigger than what those independent shops could offer. Not a replacement for the corner record store, but an evolution of it. More selection, more format, more spectacle. They believed the CD boom was coming, that video would matter as much as music, and that if they built stores large enough and confident enough, shoppers would come. They were right, but it would take 5 more years, one bold real estate decision on the busiest retail strip in the country, and a building that would become the loudest, brightest record store Toronto had ever seen, before anyone understood just how right they were. By 1991, HMV Canada was ready to make its statement. The company had explored a location on Bloor Street, but the decision came down to Yonge Street, the same stretch of pavement where Sam the Record Man's twin spinning discs had lit up the night sky since 1959, where A&A Records had built its own loyal following for decades. Then HMV Canada President Paul Alois put it plainly to the Toronto Star. If you wanted to be taken seriously in Canadian music retail, you had to be on Yonge Street, because serious music lovers inevitably found their way there. What opened at 333 Yonge Street that year was unlike anything Canadian shoppers had seen. 3 stories of glass and steel rose where an old theater once stood. Inside, more than 100 listening posts lined the walls, a number that would have seemed almost reckless to a traditional record store owner who typically offered 1 or 2 stations, if any. Here, browsing wasn't just permitted, it was the entire point. A teenager could spend 2 hours with headphones on, sampling album after album, and no one would rush them toward the register. Above the sales floor, a wall of 36 television monitors played a rotating loop of music videos, concert footage, and commercials. An early, almost prophetic gesture toward the all screens, all the time culture that hadn't arrived yet anywhere else in the city. The staff, by most accounts, were not corporate hires reciting a script. They were fans. Regulars would later describe the store's early years the way people describe a favorite bar. Not glamorous exactly, but alive. Staffed by people who could tell you which import pressing sounded better and why. The store carried everything: CDs, cassettes, VHS tapes, laser discs, organized with a precision that felt closer to a library than a shop. For anyone chasing a specific import or an out-of-print pressing, HMV on Yonge Street quickly became the first call and often the last, because the selection ran deeper than the discount chains could match. Then there was the returns policy, famously, almost absurdly generous. Open merchandise could be exchanged without a receipt, no questions asked. It was meant as a gesture of trust toward the customer. What it became inevitably was a running joke among regulars, who nicknamed the practice burn and return. Buy the CD, burn a copy of it at home, bring it back for something else. Store staff knew it happened. Head office knew it happened. For years, nobody fixed it because the goodwill it built outweighed the cost. Or at least that was the bet. The store didn't just sell culture, it hosted it. Musicians performed live inside those 3 stories on a regular basis. Green Day, the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, D'Angelo, even Puff Daddy at the height of his fame. When the Red Hot Chili Peppers played an in-store set, the crowd outside grew so large that police closed the intersection of Yonge and Edward entirely, a detail longtime Torontonians still bring up decades later as proof of what that building meant to the city. It wasn't only concerts that pulled a crowd. In October of 1992, when the Toronto Blue Jays won the World Series, nervous fans packed into the store to watch on the wall of monitors together. A spontaneous gathering that had nothing to do with music at all, and everything to do with what the store had quietly become. A place where people showed up simply because other people were there. Down in the basement, a section regulars called the Basement catered to hip-hop, dance, and electronic music fans, offering imports that were nearly impossible to find anywhere else in the city. Serious collectors still shop the specialty vinyl stores for rarities, but for anyone chasing new CD releases in those genres before they hit the mainstream, the Basement had a reputation all its own. By the mid-1990s, HMV Canada had grown well beyond its Yonge Street flagship, with locations opening in Edmonton, Montreal, and smaller markets across the country, each one carrying some version of that same energy, if not the same scale. Being named Canadian Music Retailer of the Year became less an achievement than an expectation. The company would go on to hold that title for 2 decades running. For an entire generation of Canadian teenagers and young adults, walking into HMV wasn't an errand. It was a destination in its own right, a place to kill an afternoon, to discover a band nobody else at school had heard of yet, to feel for an hour like part of something bigger than the record you eventually decided to buy. What none of those shoppers could have known, standing under those television screens in 1992 or 1996, was that the very format they were browsing, the physical disc itself, carried within it the seed of everything that would eventually come apart. How long could a business built entirely on selling plastic discs really expect to last once the discs themselves became unnecessary? That question wouldn't matter for years yet, but it was already there, quietly waiting. Success on Yonge Street answered the question HMV Canada's executives had been asking since 1986. Would Canadians embrace a music superstore built at this scale? The answer was yes, unmistakably, and the company moved fast to capitalize on it. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, HMV Canada stopped thinking in terms of individual stores and started thinking in terms of a national footprint. The strategy centered on shopping malls and high-traffic urban strips. The same real estate logic driving department stores and clothing chains across the country at the time. If a mall had strong foot traffic and a demographic that skewed young, HMV wanted a location there. Unlike the fast food and department store chains built on franchising, HMV Canada grew almost entirely as a corporate-owned operation. Head office in Toronto controlled site selection, store design, and inventory, which gave the chain a consistency that independent record shops could never match. Walk into an HMV in Edmonton or Halifax, and the layout, the listening posts, the new release wall, all felt reassuringly familiar. That consistency became the brand's quiet advantage. A shopper who loved the Yonge Street flagship could walk into a smaller HMV in a suburban mall outside Winnipeg and find the same logo, the same red and white signage, the same sense that this was a serious place to discover music, even if the store was a fraction of the size. By the early 2000s, the chain had expanded to well over 100 locations, spanning all 9 provinces the company would eventually serve. From small market stores in places like Fort McMurray to flagship-scale operations in Toronto, Edmonton, and Montreal. The suburban mall bet was not entirely a matter of ambition. It was also a recognition of where Canadian retail itself was heading. Downtown shopping districts were losing ground to enclosed malls throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And any retailer chasing a national audience had little choice but to follow the crowds into those malls. For HMV, this meant trading some of the theater and spectacle of the Yonge Street Superstore for a more modest, replicable format. Smaller footprints, tighter listening sections, but the same core promise of depth and selection that had made the flagship famous. For the people working inside these new locations, expansion meant something very real and very immediate. Store manager positions opened up in cities that had never had an HMV before, giving young music enthusiasts a path into retail management they might not have found otherwise. Staff at smaller mall locations often described a tighter, more community-feeling atmosphere than the sprawling downtown flagship. Regulars who came in every Tuesday for new releases, employees who knew customers' taste well enough to recommend an album before it was even displayed. But expansion also brought new pressure. Corporate head office set sales targets store by store, and managers who had come up loving music for its own sake now found themselves accountable to numbers on a spreadsheet, a tension that would only sharpen as the years went on. Meanwhile, the original Yonge Street flagship held its place as the undisputed center of the brand. Unlike so many founding locations in retail history that get quietly closed once a chain matures, 333 Yonge Street kept its status as the flagship for the entirety of HMV Canada's run. The store that hosted the concerts, drew the press coverage, and represented the brand's identity to the rest of the country. Every new store that opened in a mall somewhere else in Canada was, in a sense, an echo of what had first been proven true on that stretch of downtown Toronto. By the time HMV Canada reached its full national footprint of over 100 stores, the chain had accomplished something few Canadian retailers of any category had managed, a genuinely national presence built from a standing start just over a decade earlier. Music fans in Regina, Halifax, and Victoria now had access to something that had once required a trip to a handful of major cities. The chain had become, in the truest sense, Canada's store for music and entertainment. But growing this large, this fast, on the back of a single product category, physical media, meant that whatever came for CDs and DVDs would come for the entire company at once. There would be no smaller division to fall back on, no unrelated business line to absorb the shock. Every store, no matter how far from Yonge Street, was built on the same foundation. By the mid-1990s, HMV Canada had crossed a line that few retailers ever managed to cross. It was no longer simply a place to buy music. It had become part of the culture it sold. The clearest proof stood at 333 Yonge Street, where the in-store concert series had turned a retail floor into one of the most unlikely concert venues in the country. Green Day played there. So did the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, drawing crowds of teenagers who lined up for hours just to be in the same room. D'Angelo performed inside those walls. Puff Daddy did too, at the peak of his fame. turning a Tuesday afternoon on Yonge Street into an event that made the evening news. And when the Red Hot Chili Peppers took the small stage inside the store, the crowd gathered outside grew so large that Toronto police shut down the intersection of Yonge and Edward entirely, a moment that longtime staff and shoppers would recount for decades afterward as the day the record store stopped traffic in the fourth largest city in North America. This was not a marketing stunt engineered by a corporate events team chasing headlines. It grew organically out of what the store had already become, a gathering place serious enough that major touring artists wanted to play there, and popular enough that a performance inside a record shop could genuinely compete with a stadium show for cultural attention that week. The company built on that momentum deliberately. In 2010, HMV Canada launched a customer loyalty program called Pure HMV, offering points and exclusive merchandise across music, film, and gaming. Within its first 4 months, more than 300,000 customers had signed up, a staggering number for a rewards program in an era before every retailer had one, in clear evidence of how deep the brand's hold on its customer base ran. HMV wasn't just selling CDs and DVDs anymore. It was building a relationship with its shoppers, one that felt more like membership in a club than a simple transaction. The recognition followed. HMV was named Canadian Music Retailer of the Year for 20 consecutive years, an honor that reflected not just sales figures, but the depth of the chain's presence in the industry itself. Record labels, artists, and industry insiders treated HMV as the retailer that mattered most in the country. The store whose window displays and end cap placements could genuinely move a new release up or down the charts. For the employees who worked the floor during these years, the atmosphere carried its own particular electricity. Staff who had joined as music-obsessed teenagers found themselves, a few years later, greeting members of bands they'd grown up listening to, setting up sound checks in the same aisles where customers browsed an hour earlier. It was, by nearly every account from people who worked there, an unusually good job for a retail position. Not glamorous, not especially well paid, but charged with a sense that you were at the center of something that actually mattered to people. Generationally, the pattern repeated itself across the country. Parents who had grown up browsing vinyl at Sam the Record Man brought their own children into HMV to buy their first CDs. Teenagers who spent Saturday afternoons at the listening posts in the 1990s became the adults bringing their own kids in for the latest soundtrack or video game a decade later. The store had inserted itself into the rhythm of Canadian family life in a way that felt, at the time, permanent. The kind of institution nobody imagined disappearing, the same way nobody in 1991 could have pictured Yonge Street without Sam's spinning discs across the street. Geographically, HMV had achieved something rare for a Canadian retailer. It felt the same whether you walked into it in Toronto, Edmonton, or a mall outside Fredericton. That consistency, paired with the spectacle of the flagship store, gave HMV a kind of unifying national identity that few brands outside of banking or telecommunications ever achieve. It was in every meaningful sense no longer just a British import finding its footing in a foreign market. It had become something Canadians claimed as their own. None of this happened by accident, and none of it would last forever. But for a stretch of nearly 2 decades, HMV Canada stood at the exact center of the country's music culture. Not adjacent to it, not serving it from the sidelines, but genuinely, unmistakably, at its heart. What almost nobody standing in that crowd outside 333 Yonge Street, watching the Chili Peppers play through the store windows, could have guessed was how quickly all of it would come undone, and how little warning most of them would get. In 2007, a shopper walking into HMV on Yonge Street would have found nothing to suggest the beginning of the end. The store still buzzed with the same energy it had carried since 1991. New releases still lined the front tables. The listening posts were still occupied. If anything, the chain looked stronger than ever, riding 2 decades of steady growth and a loyalty program that had signed up hundreds of thousands of members within months of launching. But that same year, on the other side of the continent, Amazon released a small device called the Kindle. It seemed at the time like a niche product for book lovers. Nothing that had anything to do with a store built on CDs and DVDs. Few people working the floor at HMV that year would have connected the dots. Fewer still would have guessed that the real threat wasn't the Kindle itself, but what it represented. A shift in how people expected to acquire the things they loved, instantly digitally, without ever walking into a store at all. Digital downloads were already eating into music sales by then, and streaming was beginning to stir in the background, still too clunky and limited to feel like a serious threat to a chain with over 100 stores and 2 decades of brand loyalty behind it. HMV had even tried to get ahead of it, launching hmvdigital.ca in 2009 as its own download store. It was a reasonable response. It was also, in hindsight, a retailer trying to compete in a digital marketplace using the instincts of a physical one, and it never came close to matching what dedicated streaming services would soon offer. The first hard evidence that something had shifted arrived in June of 2011. HMV Group, the British parent company, sold its entire Canadian operation, 121 stores across 9 provinces, to Hilco Capital, a firm that specialized not in growing retailers but in restructuring struggling ones. The sale price was £2 million. For a chain that had once stopped traffic outside its flagship store, that figure landed as a quiet but unmistakable signal. The parent company no longer saw the same future in Canadian retail that it once had. Hilco moved quickly. Within months, HMV Canada announced the closure of its downtown Vancouver and Richmond Center locations, the first visible store closures most Canadian shoppers had ever seen from the chain. By 2012, the store count had dropped from 121 to 113. Hilco publicly insisted the restructuring was working, that there were no plans to close the chain altogether, and even opened a handful of new locations in growing markets like Fort McMurray to prove the point. For a while, it looked almost convincing. Inside individual stores, longtime employees began noticing something harder to quantify than a falling store count. The floor space devoted to CDs and DVDs was shrinking, replaced gradually by gifts, collectibles, clothing, and headphones. Merchandise with higher profit margins, but little connection to why customers had come to love HMV in the first place. Video games and technology hardware, once reliable traffic drivers, were pulled from shelves entirely as part of the new strategy. A shopper who had been coming to HMV since the 1990s might not have noticed the shift all at once. But visit by visit, the store that had once felt like a temple to physical media started to feel like something else. A gift shop that happened to still sell some CDs. This is the cruel arithmetic of a slow decline. No single year, no single decision felt like the end. Store managers who had built their careers on knowing music inside and out now found themselves managing merchandise categories that had nothing to do with what drew them to the job in the first place. Head office in Toronto, and increasingly in London under Hilco's ownership, framed each change as a necessary adaptation, a way to keep the lights on while physical media sales continued their industry-wide slide. Nobody inside the company was pretending everything was fine, but nobody yet believed the whole structure was about to collapse either. How long could a company built entirely on selling a format the world was actively abandoning actually expect to survive? In 2012 and 2013, that question remained mostly theoretical. The kind of thing industry analysts raised in trade publications, not something the average customer browsing the new release wall in a suburban mall gave much thought to. The stores were still open. The listing post still worked. The name on the sign hadn't changed. But underneath the surface, the arithmetic was getting worse every year, not better. Digital sales kept climbing. Physical media kept shrinking. And a company already operating on borrowed time, under an owner whose entire business model was built around managing decline rather than reversing it, was running out of room to adapt its way out of the problem it now faced. By January of 2017, the numbers behind HMV Canada told a story the storefront still hadn't fully revealed to the public. The company was carrying $39 million in debt, the weight of years running at a loss since 2014. Hilco Capital, the very firm brought in to restructure and stabilize the chain back in 2011, now faced the reality that its own turnaround plan hadn't turned anything around. Behind the merchandise shifts and quiet store closures of the previous few years lay a business that had been treading water for far longer than customers realized. The mechanics of what happened next reveal something uglier than simple market failure. On January 27, 2017, a company called Huckten Limited filed a lawsuit against HMV Canada in the Ontario Superior Court. Truck 10 was no outside creditor demanding repayment from a stranger. It was a shell company owned by a Hilco employee and business partner of Nick Williams, HMV Canada's own president and CEO, and it belonged to Paul McGowan, the same man who owned HMV's operations in the United Kingdom. In other words, the entity suing HMV Canada into receivership was connected directly to the same corporate family that had been running the company for the past 6 years. The lawsuit succeeded. Within days, Hilco Capital announced its intention to close every HMV Canada location by the end of April. What had looked from the outside like a company fighting to survive against forces beyond its control turned out to involve decisions made by people sitting inside the same boardroom that had promised, back in 2012, that there were no plans to shut things down. This is not a story of a single villain twirling a mustache in a corner office. It is a story of a private equity model that had, by its very design, treated HMV Canada less as a beloved national institution and more as an asset to be managed, extracted from, and eventually closed when the numbers stopped working in its favor. Hilco Capital's entire business specialized in retail restructuring, buying distressed chains, squeezing what value remained, and exiting when the math no longer justified continued operation. HMV Canada had been, from the moment of that 2011 sale, exactly this kind of asset. Few customers browsing the new release wall in Winnipeg or Halifax understood that the chain they loved had been operating under this logic for years. For the employees who kept the stores running through these final years, the experience carried a particular kind of quiet dread. Store managers were told repeatedly that the business was stabilizing. Corporate messaging through 2012 and 2013 had insisted the restructuring was working, and yet year after year, the merchandise mix kept shifting further from music and film, the marketing budget kept shrinking, and head office kept growing more distant, first moving from a Canadian-run operation to one increasingly directed out of the UK under Hilco's broader ownership structure. Frontline staff, many of whom had built careers around a genuine love of music rather than retail management ambitions, absorbed the brunt of this uncertainty without the information to make sense of it. They watched video games and technology hardware disappear from shelves. They watched colleagues let go as smaller locations closed one by one, starting with Vancouver and Richmond Center back in 2011. They kept showing up, kept recommending albums to regulars, kept running the listening posts without knowing that the company's own leadership structure had become entangled in the very lawsuit that would end their jobs. The most damning detail in this entire chapter is simple, and it requires no embellishment. The court filing that triggered HMV Canada's receivership came from a company tied to the people already running HMV Canada. Court documents described an inability to reach terms with major suppliers that would sustain operations and support a recovery, a carefully neutral phrase for what amounted to a company reaching the end of a runway it had been sold, deliberately to fly down for years. By this point, HMV Canada owed $56 million to its major suppliers. The company that had once stopped traffic on Yonge Street for a Red Hot Chili Peppers concert now couldn't convince the businesses supplying its shelves that a future recovery was worth betting on. And who exactly was supposed to protect the workers on the sales floor? The ones who had no visibility into boardroom finances, no seat at the table when the lawsuit was filed, and no warning beyond the same reassurances they'd been hearing for years. When the very people entrusted with saving the company were the ones who, in the end, helped bring it down, there would be no dramatic villain unmasked in a press conference. There would only be a receivership filing, a liquidation notice, and thousands of employees finding out, the same way the public did, that the company they'd trusted for decades had run out of road. The receivership filing on January 27, 2017, did not close the stores overnight. Instead, it began a strange, drawn-out period that longtime customers would remember distinctly. HMV Canada entering what the court called an orderly wind-down, with locations across 9 provinces staying open for several more weeks specifically to liquidate whatever inventory remained on the shelves. For most of the company's head office staff, the end came almost immediately. The court documents were blunt about the cause. HMV and its major suppliers had been unable to reach terms that could sustain operations and support any real recovery. Within days of the filing, most of the corporate team in Toronto was laid off. The people who had spent years managing merchandise strategy, store openings, and loyalty programs found themselves suddenly on the outside of a company they had helped run just weeks before. Out on the sales floor, the experience unfolded differently and more slowly. Store by store, staff were told the news that customers would soon see for themselves. Everything must go. Signs went up in windows across the country announcing closing sales, discounts climbing week by week as head office worked to convert what remained of the inventory into cash for the $56 million owed to suppliers. For employees who had built entire careers around a love of music and film, the job now became something else entirely, presiding over the dismantling of the very culture they had spent years building with customers. Shoppers responded the way people often do when a beloved place announces its ending. They came back, many of them for the first time in years. Longtime customers who had drifted towards streaming and online shopping found themselves walking through the doors one more time, drawn less by the markdown prices than by something harder to name, a need to see the place once more before it disappeared. Regulars who remembered the chain's earliest years browsed shelves that grew emptier by the week, watching a familiar landscape of new release walls and listing posts reduced gradually to bare metal fixtures and abandoned shopping carts. The most symbolic ending belonged fittingly to where the story had truly begun. On April 14, 2017, the flagship store at 333 Yonge Street in Toronto closed its doors for the final time, 26 years after it first opened as the building that redefined what a Canadian record store could be. The store was crowded that day, not with the curious energy of a Backstreet Boys concert or a Blue Jays celebration, but with people seeking one last bargain, one last walk through the aisles where they'd once spent entire afternoons. For the Yonge and Dundas neighborhood, the closure marked the end of a vital piece of the Strip's identity, a landmark that had outlasted Sam the Record Man and A&A Records, the very rivals it had once set out to challenge. Media coverage of the closure carried a tone distinct from typical business reporting, less analysis of balance sheets, more elegy for a cultural institution. Local Toronto outlets in particular treated the Yonge Street closure as the end of an era stretching back decades, tracing a lineage of music retail on that stretch of street that had now gone fully dark. National coverage focused on the broader story, an entire chain of over 100 stores, employing more than 1,000 people, disappearing within a matter of months. Not every part of this story ended in total loss, though the recovery came from an unexpected direction. In February 2017, even before the final stores closed their doors, Ontario-based Sunrise Records moved to acquire the leases for 70 former HMV locations across the country. Sunrise's founder, Doug Putman, had built his company from a modest 5 stores in 2014 into a growing regional chain. And he saw in HMV's collapse not just a tragedy, but an opportunity to expand into a genuinely national presence. Sunrise invited 1,240 former HMV Canada employees to apply for roughly 700 available positions, a partial lifeline, though one that meant many experienced staff would not find a path back into the industry they'd built their careers around. For the employees who didn't make that transition, the collapse meant something more permanent. Seniority built up over a decade or more, gone. The specific, hard-won knowledge of music retail, suddenly without an obvious place to apply it in a shrinking industry. For franchise-adjacent roles and store-level management, especially in smaller markets without a Sunrise conversion nearby, the closure meant searching for work in an entirely different field. What became of the physical spaces varied by location. Some, particularly in strong retail markets, were quickly reopened under the Sunrise Records banner, keeping much of the same layout and even some of the same staff, so that a shopper walking in months later might notice little difference beyond the sign above the door. Others, especially in smaller malls already struggling with vacancy, sat empty for months or longer, one more dark storefront in a retail landscape already reshaping itself around online shopping. The final image most Canadians carry of HMV's collapse is not a boardroom or a court filing. It is simpler than that. Empty shelves under fluorescent lights, a handwritten sign taped to a door, and a line of people who came back one last time to say goodbye to a place they didn't realize. until it was ending how much they had loved. The story of HMV Canada did not end cleanly with the closing of 3 Yonge Street. What happened in the months and years after the collapse reveals something more complicated than a simple death of a beloved brand. It reveals how quickly an industry can reorganize itself around a gap left by a fallen giant, and how much gets lost even when a partial recovery follows. Sunrise Records, the company that had acquired 70 former HMV leases even before the last stores closed, moved decisively to fill the vacuum. Doug Putman, who had taken over Sunrise in 2014 when it operated just 5 stores in Ontario, used the HMV collapse as the foundation for national expansion. Many of the converted locations kept much of what customers had loved about HMV: the same physical footprint, the same general layout, and in a number of cases the same staff who had transferred over from the company that had just let them go. For shoppers in cities where a Sunrise now stood where an HMV once did, the transition felt less like watching a competitor take over and more like watching an old friend change its name. What nobody at the time fully anticipated was how well this new chapter would perform. Sunrise leaned hard into a trend that had been building quietly for years: the resurgence of vinyl. Younger listeners, drawn to the physical ritual of owning music in an era when everything else lived in the cloud, began buying records again in numbers that surprised even industry veterans. By 2017 alone, Sunrise had sold at least 500,000 vinyl LPs across its converted locations, a figure that suggested physical media hadn't actually died with HMV. It had simply changed shape and changed hands. The recovery reached further than most observers expected. In 2019, Sunrise Records itself acquired the HMV brand in the United Kingdom, buying the retail operations out of administration and bringing the story full circle. A Canadian company that had grown out of HMV Canada's collapse now owned the very British parent brand that had first brought HMV to Canada back in 1986. And in February 2024, HMV made a modest return to Canadian retail altogether, appearing as branded store-within-a-store sections inside Toys R Us locations across the country, carrying music, home video, and pop culture collectibles under a name that Canadian shoppers hadn't seen on a standalone storefront in 7 years. But recovery for the brand did not mean recovery for everyone who had built a career around it. The 340 former HMV Canada employees invited to apply for positions at Sunrise were competing for roughly 700 spots, meaning close to half would not find a path back into the industry they knew. For many of these workers, particularly those who had spent a decade or more mastering the specific knowledge of music retail, the collapse meant an unplanned career change into fields with little connection to what they'd built their working lives around. The broader lesson HMV Canada's collapse offered the retail industry was not really about music, or even about digital disruption in the abstract. It was about what happens to a company once ownership shifts from operators who love a business to firms whose primary skill lies in managing the decline of distressed assets. HMV Canada's fall wasn't purely inevitable the moment streaming appeared. Plenty of physical media retailers found ways to adapt, narrow their focus, and survive on a smaller footprint, as Sunrise Records itself would go on to prove. What sealed HMV Canada's fate, in the end, was a corporate structure that treated the chain as something to be extracted from rather than something to be rebuilt. The economic impact rippled outward beyond the company itself. Malls that had anchored an HMV location, particularly in smaller cities without a Sunrise conversion nearby, faced yet another empty storefront in an era when retail vacancies were already climbing. Suppliers owed money and the receivership absorbed losses of their own, and an entire generation of Canadians lost easy physical access to a kind of music discovery that no algorithm has ever fully replicated. The experience of browsing a shelf, picking up something unfamiliar, and deciding on instinct alone to take a chance on it. What does a country lose when a place built for exactly that kind of discovery disappears, even if something resembling it eventually returns under a different name? Sunrise Records answered part of that question by proving physical music retail could still survive in Canada. But for the specific version of that experience that existed at 3 Yonge Street in 1991, the concerts, the crowds, the wall of televisions, the particular alchemy of that one building at that one moment. There was no bringing it back. Some things once gone simply become memory. Picture it one last time. It is a Saturday afternoon sometime in the 1990s, and the doors at 323 Yonge Street swing open onto 3 stories of glass and light. The air carries that particular smell of shrink-wrapped plastic and fresh carpet. The low hum of 100 conversations layered under whatever new release is playing over the speakers. A wall of televisions flickers overhead, looping music videos nobody quite stops to watch, but everybody notices. Somewhere near the back, a stranger leans over a listening post, headphones pressed to their ears, eyes closed, discovering a song that will follow them for the rest of their life. Down in the basement, the bass line from an import 12-inch bleeds faintly up the stairwell. Outside on the sidewalk, a small crowd lingers by the windows, waiting for a glimpse of whatever band is playing inside that afternoon. This was never just a store. For a few hours on a Saturday, it was the center of the city. What HMV Canada offered was never really about the plastic cases stacked on its shelves. It was about the particular kind of discovery that only happens when you put your hands on something before you understand why you want it. Flipping past 100 album covers on your way to the one that stops you, reading liner notes standing in an aisle, trusting a recommendation from a stranger behind the counter who happened to know more than you did. It was about the ritual of arriving somewhere specifically to look, with no guarantee of what you'd leave with, and the particular thrill of leaving with something unexpected anyway. For a generation of Canadian teenagers, HMV was where musical taste got built, one Saturday afternoon at a time, not algorithmically suggested, not curated by a streaming service that already knew what you liked, but stumbled into, argued about with friends, occasionally embarrassing, occasionally life-changing. It was where a parent who grew up on Sam the Record Man brought their own kids to buy a first CD, passing down not just music, but the act of shopping for it, browsing for it, choosing it with your own 2 hands. It mattered, too, as a gathering place in a way few retail stores ever manage. A crowd closing down an intersection to catch a glimpse of a band playing inside a record store is not something that happens by corporate design. It happens because a place has become something more than a business, a landmark people organize their memories around, the way they might remember exactly where they stood the night the Blue Jays won the World Series. Watching it unfold on a wall of borrowed televisions surrounded by strangers who, for one night, weren't strangers at all. No algorithm has replicated that particular alchemy. Streaming services can suggest 1,000 songs in a fraction of a second, more accurately, more efficiently than any store clerk ever could. What they cannot offer is the specific, unrepeatable feeling of 100 people standing shoulder to shoulder in the same room, discovering something together at the same moment for no reason other than that they showed up. HMV Canada is gone in the form that made it matter most. The building at 333 Yonge Street still stands, though what fills it now bears no resemblance to the store that once stopped traffic outside its windows. Some of its former locations carry on under a different name, staffed in places by the very people who once wore an HMV badge, still helping strangers find the record they didn't know they were looking for. That continuity deserves to be honored, not dismissed. A piece of the story that refused to end entirely, even when the company that started it did not survive. To the employees who spent their careers behind those counters, who knew the new releases before the customers did, who kept showing up long after the warning signs were impossible to ignore, the store you built mattered more than any balance sheet ever recorded. To the founders and executives who took a gamble on a strange, borrowed name in 1986, and to the ones who later opened the doors of that Yonge Street superstore in 1991, whatever came after, you built something Canadians genuinely loved. And to every customer who ever spent an afternoon there, who bought their first CD, who stood in a crowd outside those windows waiting for a band to start playing, the memory you're carrying is real, and it was earned. Something genuine happened inside those walls. It is worth remembering exactly as it was,